Welcome. I am Patricia Rosenmeyer, the director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm really pleased to see so many of you here joining us today for one of our Emerging Scholars Talks. This series allows our graduate students to share their fascinating research. So I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Tara Jordan. She's a PhD candidate in musicology at the University of North Carolina, and she holds a Bachelor of Music from Furman University and a Master's of Music from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. Her dissertation, entitled Monastir, Remembrance and Reconstruction of Interwar Monastir's Jewish Musical Life, examines the role that music played in the cultural life of the Monastirli Jewish community from 1912 until 1943, through a combination of archival and oral historical approaches, collected from archives and diasporic communities throughout the US and North Macedonia. In studying a community destroyed by the Holocaust, the project seeks to recover the cultural life of Monastir, which is now known as Bitola, through music, revealing larger linguistic, religious, and secular trends of this formerly thriving Sephardic Jewish center. Tara's research has been supported by the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, the American Musicological Society, and the UNC Department of Music. In 2023-24, that is right now, she is holding a dissertation completion fellowship from the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, and she's scheduled to defend her dissertation very soon, early April, and graduate this May, which is just wonderful. I also want to let you know that we have Brett Ashley Kaplan with us, who is our Cohen Distinguished Visiting Professor from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And she and I will be monitoring the questions and encouraging some discussion after the talk. So I would like to suggest that everyone, when the time comes, put your questions in the chat. That will be easiest, and then you can either read them yourselves or Brett and I will read them out aloud. So without further ado, I will hand things over to Tara Jordan, and I look forward to hearing what she has to say.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for the introduction, and thank you to the center for having me. I'm really excited to share this research with you all. This comes from my dissertation's 4th chapter. So I'm excited to hear your questions, and I hope you all enjoy. On March 11, 1943, Monastir's Jews were forced from their homes and deported to Treblinka, where they were all killed on the morning of April 5th, destroying a Jewish community that had been established nearly 500 years prior. Today, the remaining communities of Monastirli Jews can only be found in New York City, Rochester, Indianapolis, and Jerusalem. These small pockets of Monastirli immigrants spread throughout the world are all that remains of the formerly thriving Jewish community of Monastir, today known as Bitola. Doubly exiled from the Iberian Peninsula and from the city of Monastir, where 300 Sephardim began to rebuild their lives following their expulsions from Spain and Portugal, these Monastirlis are forced to contend with the legacy of the near total destruction of their Jewish community by the mass deportations of Jews under the Nazi occupation of Yugoslavia. How do historians study these destroyed societies? And specifically for my work, how do we recover cultural artifacts like music that have overwhelmingly been lost to time? In this talk, I explore the ways in which contemporary Monastirli musicians Sarah Aroeste and Daniel Elias contend with these historiographical questions in their musical practices as they share the traditions of their ancestors with audiences around the world. Following the expulsion order of the Spanish Jews in 1492, approximately 175,000 Jews left Spain and settled primarily around the Mediterranean, and at least 60,000 Sephardim settled in Ottoman lands. Some of those 60,000 eventually made their way to Monastir, which held 300 Jews by 1544. Monastir is indicated here on the map under its contemporary name Bitola. By 1600, the community had founded 2 synagogues within its Jewish neighborhood, Kahal Kadosh Aragon and Kahal Kadosh Portugal, the names of which harken back to the Sephardim's geographical origins. One of the most important aspects of Monastirli Jewish life was their language, Judeo-Spanish, referred to by most Monastirli simply as Jewish. Because the community was largely cloistered from the rest of the city, many Jewish inhabitants were monolingual in Judeo-Spanish, particularly women and girls who did not have access to formal educations. At Monastir's Talmud Torah, the community's only school until the 19th century, students translated Hebrew into Judeo-Spanish so that they could be better understood by the wider population. If men chose to continue with their education after attending the Talmud Torah school, it was only then that they learned other languages, usually beginning with Turkish or French. Even as the community became increasingly multilingual during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Judeo-Spanish remained the primary language for 98% of Monastir's Jews. While the vast majority of Judeo-Spanish speakers were killed during the Holocaust, many Sephardim still consider the language a key part of their heritage, and Aroeste and Elias sing in the Monastirli dialect of Judeo-Spanish when performing songs from the city. Throughout my dissertation, wherein I pieced together Monastirli Jewish musical life from the interwar era, and particularly when examining Monastirli musical practices of today, I built on Edwin Ceruzzi's idea of quote-unquote sonic ruins from his 2019 monograph. Ceruzzi suggests that music scholars look at folk song as, quote, a place, a ruined site that is visited and revisited during any utterance of and exposure to it. Ceruzzi argues that we now live in a quote-unquote post-tradition era that makes building upon these ruins, rather than generating new construction, possible, even as modern folk songs occur, quote, in the space that ruins occupy in the modern imagination, end quote. Our contemporary interest in ruins, quote, allows for addressing folk songs as sites of remembrance, as well as audible, and after MTV and YouTube, also visual, constructions of the past that can be visited and experienced in the present. In their musical performances, Aroeste and Elias locate and visit Monastir's sonic ruins, and Aroeste even uses them as a foundation upon which she builds her own version of the city, thus bringing Monastir's long-standing cultural legacy into the 21st century. In addition to my framework of sonic ruins, I also draw from Marianne Hirsch's theory of post-memory, a type of intergenerational transmission of memory that she describes as such. Descendants of victim survivors, as well as perpetrators and of bystanders who witnessed massive traumatic events, connect so deeply to the previous generation's remembrances of the past that they identify that connection as a form of memory, and that in certain extreme circumstances, memory can be transferred to those who are not actually there to live an event. While the Monastirli Jews who immigrated to the United States left well before the events of the Holocaust and were therefore not directly victimized by the Nazi regime, they nonetheless faced their own set of traumas, as fires, extreme poverty, and a series of wars made their lives in their hometown untenable during the First World War. Hirsch limits her own work and exploration of post-memory to the second generation of survivors, which I intended to do as well before I began my ethnographic work. However, I discovered that, at least in the United States, only 2 of the children of those who left Monastir were still living. One of these 2 men passed away very recently on January 11, 2024, leaving only a single member of this generation left in the United States. Necessity then drove me to expand my fieldwork by interviewing the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Monastirli immigrants in the United States, including both Daniel Elias and Sarah Aroeste. Daniel Elias is a New York-based musician and the vocalist and clarinetist for the long-standing Elias Ladino Ensemble, originally founded by his late father. Ladino is another name for Judeo-Spanish. The ensemble also features upright bassist Marco Brown, drummer Casey Bond, and oudist and guitarist Maurice Sadaka. Daniel's grandparents, David Elias Casorla and Sarah Casorla, emigrated from Monastir, where his grandfather was a rabbi, to New York City in the early 20th century. Sarah Casorla, who Daniel refers to affectionately as quote-unquote Shorty, continued to sing in the way that she was taught in Monastir and passed her songs down to her son Joe, who in turn passed them down to Daniel, thus participating in an intergenerational line of oral transmission, as Daniel indicated during a concert that he gave on July 19, 2023. Late in Sarah's life, unbeknownst to Daniel, Jo recorded her singing all of the songs she could remember from Monastir and kept these recordings in his basement until his death. When Daniel began to clean out his father's house after his passing in 2021, he discovered boxes of cassette tapes with his grandmother's voice on them and turned to his friends Joe and Zach Yusha, a father and son also descended from Monastirli immigrants, to digitize these recordings. Zach Yusha now works with the band to organize regular concerts and tours, including a memorial concert for Monastir on the 80th anniversary of the deportations at the Kahila Synagogue and Museum, and a musical tour of North Macedonia in the summer of 2023. I've spoken with Daniel and attended his performances several times, including the musical performance in New York and on 3 occasions during his group's tour of North Macedonia. During these meetings, I spoke with Daniel extensively about his grandmother and his musical training overall. When describing his grandmother at a Monastirli memorial concert on March 11, 2023, he stated that, quote, "My grandma was wonderful. She was a beautiful singer, but she wasn't exceptional, I don't think. I think people were doing it all around her. That's how she came to learn." This quote indicates the thriving musicality of Monastirli Jews that Sarah continued to speak about and sing herself late into her life. Importantly, however, Sarah did not perform her songs publicly. In keeping with the domestic romance tradition, she taught them to her children within her home. It was her son and grandson who began performing these songs for the public in order to memorialize Sarah Kasorla and Monastir more broadly, and to share their culture with their audiences. I first met Daniel 80 years to the day after Monastirli Jews were deported from Bitola, as concertgoers, myself included, crowded into the small sanctuary of the Kahila Kedoshi Synagogue and Museum to hear songs from Monastir. Co-sponsored by the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, the North Macedonian UN delegation, and Kahila Kadosha, the event, titled Songs We Still Sing, a memorial concert for the Sephardic Jews of Monastir, featured the Elias Ladino Ensemble with Zach Yucha as MC, performing the songs of Daniel's family from the synagogue's bima, as you can see in the picture here. After welcoming attendees to the event, thanking the concert sponsors, and introducing the band, Zach Yucha explained the significance of the event, reminding everyone that the day of the concert marked the 80th anniversary of the deportations of Macedonia's Jews, and calling for an Askava prayer. After the prayer, led by Kahila Kudoshayanina's vice president Andrew Marcus, Zach then read a letter from Goran Sadakario, who is a descendant of Monastirli Jews, leader of the Jewish community of North Macedonia, and director of the Holocaust Memorial Center for the Jews of North Macedonia. Calling for renewed unity between Monastirli communities in the US and North Macedonia, Goran authored a letter to be read by Zach, claiming that, quote, "Our roots are the same. You are gathered here in New York, just as we are gathered in Skopje, to honor those roots. Hatred failed, we survived, we remembered." Zach followed up Goran's powerful words by describing the surviving Macedonian Jewish communities around the world, stating that the survival of these communities is, quote, "cause for open celebration," and describing Daniel as a direct inheritor of Monastirli music. He concluded his remarks with the following words: "What you will hear tonight is exceedingly rare. It's as close as we will get to hearing the Jewish community of Bitola before March 11, 1943. Zach's final statement showcases Daniel as a tradition bearer who grounds himself in historical fidelity. Daniel and the Elias Ladino Ensemble strive to show what was, via Daniel's own post-memory of Monastir. As such, their group features instruments readily available in Bitola prior to 1943 and that Sarah indicated were normative. The historical songs are sung in Sarah's dialect of Judeo-Spanish, and Daniel often pauses the musical performance to speak to the audience about the historical context and lyrical translations of the music, as you can never assume a full audience knows Judeo-Spanish. The band does not perform any original compositions, instead focusing on sharing this historic repertoire. Per performance studies scholar Diana Taylor, who argues for performance as a method of storing and transmitting knowledge, the acts of performance serves as a means of embodied knowledge. In writing about the transmission of cultural history amongst indigenous peoples in the Americas, Taylor argues that particularly in societies where cultural transmission and preservation via writing was not the norm, performance stands as a method of transmission for knowledge, identity, and memory, both to the practitioners and the audience. Taking up Taylor's ideas of performance as embodied knowledge and applying them to Monastir, which had a largely orally transmitted musical culture, Daniel's performances serve to teach both him as a performer engaging in a key act of cultural identity and reinscribing the lessons passed down to him from his family, and us as we see and hear Monastirli culture from one of their own. When Daniel took the stage after Zach's pronouncement that this is as close as we would get to prior to 1943, he quickly lightened the mood of the audience, stating that, quote, "We're going to begin with a song about a beautiful girl. Most of our songs are about beautiful girls. Some are about bad guys, but most are about beautiful girls." He then jumped into a lively love song. The song and many others on that night's program feature grand stories of love and heartbreak with women at its center. This gynocentrism reflects the source material. As a primarily women's genre, many romances feature aspirational women for young girls to view as role models. They also provide stories of appropriate romantic conventions for mothers to teach their daughters, and on occasion, cautionary tales about the quote unquote bad guys that Daniel referenced. Additionally, many of the songs feature sexual imagery and innuendo, both implicit and explicit, and showcase the very real sexual lives of these women, including their premarital sexual education, which is so often taboo. The concert that evening alternated between somber, as the specter of deportation hung over the event, and lighthearted as Daniel told anecdotes about his family, cracked jokes when describing the songs, and often danced along with the lyrics as he performed particularly upbeat selections. From his inherited sonic ruins of Monastir, he built a lively, multifaceted community for us to celebrate and mourn in turn. One of the most powerful moments of the evening occurred when Daniel shared a recording of his grandmother singing with the audience. Singing a song called Vate Vate Vate, a song where a woman tells a dishonest man with whom she had been in a relationship to get out, Sarah's voice filled the sanctuary of Kehila Kadosha, and she came to life again, teaching all of us in the audience about the music of her home from a grainy cassette tape. Daniel followed up Shorty's rendition of Vate 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 with his own version, accompanied by the full band. The Udis, Maurice Sadaka, had switched to a guitar for this song. Before playing, Daniel revealed that the guitar was constructed from Macedonian lumber by Joe and Zach Yucha and was an exact replica of the guitar housed in the quote-unquote Jewish room of the Auto and Ethno Museum Philip Kirklino, a small family-owned museum located about 5 miles from Beetla. The guitar was owned by Jewish carpenter Nassim, who was deported alongside his wife Rebecca on March 11. With Sarah, Nassim, and Rebecca at the forefront of our minds, we listened to one of the only remaining Monastirli musicians in the world perform a song that showcased the vitality and playfulness of his lost ancestors. Four months after their moving New York performance, I attended another of the Elias Ladino Ensemble's concerts, this time in Beetla, where the group was traveling with Zach Yucha, the organizer, on a musical tour of North Macedonia, with stops in Ohrid, a popular lakeside tourist town, Skopje, the nation's capital, and Beetla, the ancestral home of the Elias and Yucha families. Many of the songs that the Elias Ladino Ensemble performed that evening were the same as their March performance in New York, as Daniel emphasized the lightheartedness of the many love songs sung by his grandmother and father. Once again, the highlight of the evening was Daniel playing a recording of his grandmother. This moment in Beetla marked Sarah Casorla's return to her home, over 100 years after she left with her husband to resettle in the United States. After playing a 2-minute recording of Sarah's version of a love song entitled Chiquitica, which per Daniel was unique to the Monastirli community, Daniel told the audience that, quote, she sang that song here in Monastir, here in Bitola, before she left in about 1911. And the return of her voice to Bitola marked perhaps the first time since 1943 that this song echoed through the city streets. So we're going to take about 2 minutes of our time and listen to Sarah.
If we ask her nicely, maybe she'll come and sing it. My grandmother was named Sarah Elias Casorla, and she was very short. So everybody called her Shorty. But she knew hundreds and hundreds of songs. And here's one of them with her singing it, and then we'll sing it.
De mi niña, si es por tomarme o por gozar de mí, dímelo si es por tomarme o por gozar de mí, si es por mi vida, al punto te la daré, si es por mi vida, al punto te la daré.
If we ask
Even though we have no way of knowing if Sarah Cazorla ever sang that song in the exact position of the concert that evening, she surely walked the city's largest thoroughfare where we were located during her lifetime, perhaps humming to herself as she went. And she certainly sang the song in her Monastirli home and the city's Jewish neighborhoods. In playing his grandmother's song recording, followed by his own rendition of the song, Daniel, the Elias Ladino Ensemble, and the audience were all transported back in time to a moment when Jewish women walked the streets of Bitola. In addition to teaching their audiences about Monastir and its musical traditions, and building upon the city's sonic ruins, the Elias Ladino Ensemble's memorial performances for Monastir, both in New York and Macedonia, also serve as acts of musical witness to the horrors of the Holocaust. In an era that Ceruzzi argues is marked by a quote-unquote anxiety of forgetting, particularly in regard to the cultural practices of communities destroyed by traumas of the 20th century, memorialization via museums, marches, performances, and witness become imperative. Theorizing musical witness specifically, Amy Ludarsky writes that musicians who are not physically present at traumatic events can nevertheless serve as witnesses. While she applies this theory to composers, I apply it to musicians of the post-memory generation and generations, such as Daniel and next Sarah Aroeste. For Monastir, a community with no living Holocaust survivors, secondary witnesses are the only witnesses left, and therefore become doubly important. For Ludarsky, a key feature of musical witness is its audience, which becomes a witness itself by receiving and interpreting the witness testimony of the musician, whose performance becomes, quote, a site of exchange onto which they inscribe their understanding of the Holocaust, end quote. Even while Daniel's immediate family left Monastir during the 1910s, well before the Shoah came to Macedonia, they still experienced the trauma of displacement from their ancestral home that was later destroyed and lost their extended family and community. Daniel serves as a member of the generations of post-memory and secondary witness to these traumas. In his memorial performances, therefore, he memorializes, teaches about, learns from, and witnesses the Jewish community of Monastir. The granddaughter of Monastirli immigrants, New York-based musician Sarah Aroeste is one of the key contemporary figures in Sephardic music, with a particular focus on Monastirli music. Her 2021 album, Monastir, features 10 songs, 5 in Macedonian and 5 in Judeo-Spanish, that showcase the culture of the region before its destruction. One of the 5 Macedonian tracks, titled Jovana Jovanka, is also sung in Hebrew. Sarah's grandfather immigrated to the United States in 1912, and by the time that Sarah was born in the 1970s, the romances of Monastir had largely faded from her family's culture. During our interview in November 2022, she told me that her great aunts and grandfather did speak Ladino often, especially when cooking, but noted that they never sang in the home. After Sarah had children of her own, however, her elder cousin, Rachel Namias, taught her the Ladino finger games and children's songs that she learned in Monastir. These are included in track 5 of the Monastir album entitled Estrella Mar. To complete this album without the intergenerational transmission that Daniel Elias has, Sarah then had to complete significant independent research into Monastirli music, combining her own experiences within the Monastirli diaspora, archival research in Bitola, and ethnographic work in Bitola to put together the 10 tracks she felt most represented her lost community. Sarah's Monastir represents her own sonic construction of the city, built upon her post-memories and the sonic ruins that she found in her research. Unlike Daniel and the Elias Ladino ensemble, who aim for historical fidelity in their performances, Sarah recreates, imagines, and composes Monastir through an explicitly 21st century lens. Much like Daniel, however, Sarah too serves as a secondary musical witness to the traumas experienced by her community. Aroeste opens her album with Oikwe Mezi, a traditional life cycle song celebrating the birth of a son. You can see the first verse both in Judeo-Spanish and English here on the screen. While versions of the song were popular throughout Macedonia and Greece, Aroeste features a version unique to Monastir and sets the song in a traditional way, harkening back to how it might have sounded in Monastir prior to 1943. She uses tambourine, shofar, and drums to accompany the lyrics, all of which would have been available to Monastirli Jews, and the song is sung exclusively by women, the traditional performers and teachers of Judeo-Spanish song. The uplifting celebratory tone of the song highlights communal celebrations that occurred when a son was born, and while likely dramatized for the album recording, Aroeste's version of the song remains faithful to the musical traditions of Monastir that's known to scholars and community members. Unlike the traditional Oikwe Mezi, the 9th track on the album, Mi Monastir, is a newly composed piece with Aroeste's original Judeo-Spanish text, and therefore provides a rare example of a newly generated piece of Monastirli culture. The songs give us insight into Aroeste's Monastir. Using the memories passed down to her by her grandfather and cousin, she built her own image of this lost space by tying in elements of Monastirli life such as taralikus, a type of cookie, the games played in the cortijos or courtyards of the Jewish neighborhood, and her cousin's mezuzah, which a non-Jewish neighbor took from her family's door on the day of the deportations to give back to them upon their return to the city. The lyrics create the cortijos of the Jewish quarter, alive with families and friends eating and playing games together, thus constituting a sonic reconstruction of the Jewish neighborhood that was demolished during the Second World War. The refrain of the song pleads to the city itself to return home, and the final line states that the memories sing to me, thus highlighting the importance of memory to Monastir's continued existence in diaspora and the role of post-memory in Sarah's conceptualization of her lost home. Aroeste begins her construction with her own solo voice, accompanied by a simple guitar line, which is how many romances of the past would have been sung. The first verse and refrain, which you can see here on the screen, are sung in a strictly historically informed manner and speak exclusively to the Monastir of old, as Aroeste assures Monastir that it is not forgotten and that its children are waiting to return to it. At this point in the song's narrative, Monastir is lost and destroyed, with only one person, Aroeste, invoking its memory. As she continues, however, Aroeste begins to construct her own Monastir lyrically and musically. In the second verse, she first mentions the Teraligus and Curtivos of Monastir, and by the second intonation of the refrain, an all-women's choir joins her solo voice. At the end of the verse, a piano repeats the melody of the refrain. This is the first example of a non-traditional instrument joining the guitar, thus indicating Monastir's shifting musical traditions. We're going to listen to a snippet of that here.
Ti veio caminhar nel cortijo, riendo con primos e amigos, comiendo tarralicos, e sempre tan alto, jugando juguitos, e sempre tan alto. Monastir.
As the song continues, the piano grows more and more prominent, eventually taking over the voice altogether in an extended florid solo punctuated by monosyllabic chords from the all-female choir. Following the solo, Aroeste and her choir once again return to the refrain, and as she states the memories sing to me or las memorias me cantan for a final time, her vocals fade into a distant echo of the Muslim call to prayer, highlighting Monastir's Ottoman traditions and hearkening back to a time when the city remained largely peaceful. In Monastir, Sarah Aroeste constructs and sounds her version of contemporary Monastir despite the physical destruction of Jewish Monastir during the 1940s. Drawing inspiration and source material from pre-Holocaust musical sources and family histories, her combination of traditional Jewish folk song, Macedonian folk song, and her newly composed Me Monastir, she both memorializes Jewish Monastir and gives us a Monastir of today. Simultaneously, Daniel Elias and the Elias Ladino Ensemble memorialize Daniel's version of Monastir through presenting a more traditional version of these songs taken from Daniel's own post-memory in his family recordings. These performances are designed to showcase what life was like prior to 1943. For a city that is rapidly fading from living memory, and for other communities like Monastir that have been largely lost to time, Sarah's new construction, built on sonic ruins, and alongside Daniel's historical reenactments showcasing ruins as they once were, form a new Monastirli culture for the descendants of Monastirli Jews to grasp. One that is informed by and serves as a musical witness to the past, but that speaks to the present and that honors those who have come before. The musical practices of Daniel Elias and Sarah Aroeste highlight many of the larger driving questions behind my dissertation project. In what way does memory interact with history? How do memories shape the imagining of Monastir within the diaspora? What role does Monastirli traditional music play in today's Monastirli communities, or do they even know them? How is this music disseminated? And most importantly, for this project, what did and what does Monastir sound like? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and also amazing to hear some of the sounds themselves. I encourage anyone who wishes to put a question in the chat or a comment. I could start us off by just asking, do you have a sense of what audiences prefer? I'm sorry about the echo. Is there a sense that there are traditionalists and there are sort of modernists, or how do the audiences respond?
So before I answer the question, I do want to say I've never had the opportunity to hear Sarah perform live. So the Monastir album is like super easily available via like Bandcamp, SoundCloud. and Spotify. So I've only listened to the album in that way, and I've watched videos of her live performances, but I've never been there myself. With that said, Sarah is, because of this easily accessible album, is much more well known within the diasporic communities that I've traveled to. So they're both based in New York City, but at least in my experience, people only know Daniel if they've had the opportunity to see him, and that kind of can often be by happenstance. Like, it's totally by happenstance that I met him, even though he was so formative for this project. Um, so in that way, I would say that Sarah is more well known because she has higher level of commercialization for her Monastirli songs. But Daniel also just discovered these in 2021. He hasn't been working with them for all that long, aside from just what he could remember. So it's different than having a record you can go listen to again and again. So I've gotten a lot of recommendations to listen to Sarah Aroeste when I go into synagogues. I ask them about music and they're like, "Oh, do you know about Sarah?" And I'm like, "Yes, I do." But as an audience member, people are always so impressed when Daniel lifts up his iPad to play a recording from his iPad through a microphone of his grandmother. People are almost always really, really impressed and really like connected to that moment. So I would say I don't know if there's a preference. One is certainly more popular than the other, but I don't think that's because of preference. I think that's more because of like the business of music.
That makes sense. Did I understand correctly that he was actually singing with his grandmother? It was like,
Yeah, so in the back half of the recording, he kind of like can't help himself and jumps in a little bit. Yeah.
Yaron, do you want to ask your question or shall I ask it for you? Hey, okay. I'm not sure if perhaps you're still muted. So the question is the oud player, right? His name was Sadak, sounded like Sadaka. So is
Yes.
there any connection to Neil Sedaka?
Yes. I'm not sure. I've never heard of a Neil Sedaka. Maurice Sedaka's name is spelled with two C's and not a K. But that sometimes people spell like the same name very different ways. So I'm not sure if it's just a discrepancy there. I know Maurice is from Turkey and he's not Jewish. So if that fits with Neil Sedaka, perhaps they know one another, but I've never heard that connection.
Great. And I apologize. I think that you all are permanently muted. So please do type your questions in, and Brett and I will alternate reading them.
I can definitely jump in with some questions. This was so interesting. Thank you so much. Okay, so I have a couple of like, have you heard of this connection kind of things? And then I have a bigger sort of question. So the first, have you heard of this connection, is that Sarah Aroeste actually performed with Anthony Mordechai Zvi Russell, who is this really incredible Yiddish singer. And the title is something like Yiddish Meets Ladino. But they did this really wonderful collaboration. And I mean, not that you want to include it in your dissertation, but I just thought it was a kind of wonderful thing, you know?
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah. And then another kind of, it's in a very different vein, but we just invited to Illinois for International Holocaust Remembrance Day next year, 25, Zisel Sleplevich, who's done this project called Songs from Testimonies, which again, I just thought like, this might be something interesting just for you to know about if you don't already, which is he has listened to hours and hours and hours of testimony at the USC archive. And when people sing songs, he then pulls out the moments of song in the testimonies and then provides a kind of orchestral like sort of magnification of those songs and then performs them with an orchestra. It's really incredible. So that it's a different way of having, like, your central thing is so much about music as witness and memory and all of that stuff. So I just thought that would be another interesting thing. But then,
yeah, sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, but then my sort of overall big question is like, I'd love to hear more about the idea of a sonic ruin and how that relates to the concept of a musical witness, because it also relates to your central concept of post-memory. But what I'm wanting to hear more about is the ways in which the idea of a ruin is actually being sort of fought back against by the reproduction of this music, right? Because the music is the thing, in a sense, that has remained and that is in fact sort of carrying memory. So in that sense, the music is so sort of wonderfully like not ruined.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for that question. So as I mentioned, the idea of sonic ruins comes from Edwin Ceruzzi's monograph, and Sonic Ruins is the title of the monograph. It was very recently published in English. I had the Spanish version of it before that, because it's been out in Spanish for a couple of years. So I think what the idea of sonic ruins says that even today, um, so even if you're listening to a contemporary performance, not a recording from the era, it is still a ruin because it's not, because this post-tradition era after the rupture of the Holocaust kind of rendered all of these folk songs ruins in a way. And so much like historical ruins, we can visit them, we can like make AI reconstructions of ruins like they do at the Colosseum. We can do all these things with them, but they are still ruins. And I think in this talk that I gave today, it's harder. It doesn't give the full scope of what's been lost because I wanted to just talk about what exists still and these contemporary practices. So I think even though these songs today don't necessarily sound like ruins, like they're not fragmentary, they're full songs, fully composed, fully imagined, performed for an audience, there's still only a ruin of what was. So Dan is so lucky to have these recordings of his grandma, but that's still only one woman's memory. And she left in 1911. There was 30 years of sonic life that happened after that she was not privy to. And that's the case for most people in the US diaspora. Most people did leave around 1910, many because the city was destroyed in bombings, and many to avoid Ottoman conscription. Once Jews were conscripted into the Ottoman army, they left to avoid military service. So um, I think that's how the idea of ruin would play in with this idea of witness, because like it is a witness, but it's also, yeah, it's also still a fragment in a lot of ways, even if it doesn't sound like it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that totally
Okay.
answers my question. And another thing that occurs to me as you were answering is the connection between like a sonic ruin and the general kind of field of sound studies. Like musicology and sound studies are very sort of closely related, and you're obviously looking at music specifically, but you're also a little bit using the language of sound studies outside of musicology. I just wondered if you could speak to that.
Yes, certainly. So I do. So Ceruzzi does specifically say sonic ruins, not musical ruins. And I also really ascribe to that because a lot of the things I study in other chapters of the dissertation, for example, are not musical performances like the ones that I looked at today. It's synagogue services, in chapter 1 of the dissertation, for example. And uh, synagogue services are filled with so many sounds, musical and otherwise. And all of those sounds are really important to the experience of being there. So chapter 1 talks much more holistically about like the sound of a space and not just the music of a space. Whereas the work of Daniel and Sarah is very much a musical performance. So earlier on in this is pulled from my final chapter of my dissertation, and it's paired with studying the sounds of Holocaust Museum Remembrance, and so the sounds of Holocaust museums that mention the Jews of Macedonia. Some of those have music and some don't. And so it's the sound of a Holocaust museum that so many around the world play of trains departing as you get to a certain point of the museum is something that I talk about quite a lot. So yeah, musicology and sound studies, the lines are very, very blurred in this dissertation. I definitely pull from both of those fields, yeah.
Awesome. I'll let people put questions in the chat, or I guess, can people not raise their hands? Is that what you were saying, Patricia?
We did an automatic mute because often there's a lot of background noise, so people cannot speak, I'm afraid.
I can click the option to allow participants to unmute themselves if that would be helpful.
Sure.
Yeah.
And actually, I was going to ask you, how did you come across this as an idea? It's such a fascinating story.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for the question. So when I first came to Chapel Hill, I was a Renaissance Catholic music scholar. That's how I really thought of myself. So Jewish studies is very new to me, um, and very um, fortuitous that it happened actually. So it was, during the COVID-19 pandemic, all of us were like, "What's the point of anything?" And as a person in Renaissance studies, I felt that really hard. I Renaissance studies is super super valuable, but in for me during COVID, I just felt like my work was so disconnected from like the terrible reality of what was happening in the world. And so I had a moment of like personal crisis because I loved my work deeply in Renaissance studies, but I wanted to do something that felt more pressing. And so I went my favorite teacher in the musicology department happened to know quite a lot about Jewish studies. And so I just took the religious music through line of that. And then just started kind of devouring everything I could get my hands on about Sephardic music. And I came across a monograph that talked about Monastir, and I read the monograph like as if it were a novel. Like I think I devoured it in like a day or two. And I am not Jewish. Before this I have no Jewish background. Like 2021 was the first I've heard of this. But I just felt so connected to the story that I had read, and I wanted to be able to play a part in it. So I kind of just fell in love with the community and really really wanted to study it. And luckily they let me because so much of it was dependent on going to all of these synagogues and talking to all of these people. So that's kind of how it happened.
Great. Well, I'm sure they're very grateful that you have brought this all surface. And yeah, it's really fascinating. Such a wonderfully interdisciplinary study as well. Yeah. So any brave souls out there? Any curious souls? Ah, Adam, I think you are unmuted now. I think Tara unmuted everybody, so it's all yours.
Tara, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I think you're doing really important work. I'm wondering if in the early 20th century there was field work done to preserve ballads in Monastir. I know of some Spaniards who were working in Thessaloniki in the 30s to preserve some ballads. Of course, they were writing them down, but I'm wondering if there are other ways in which this musical legacy has been preserved.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Yes, my second chapter is all about this. So there actually were a great number, or not a great number, but a great number for comparatively how small like the community is. 2 or 3 people, but a good number of people who were interested in this dialect of Judeo-Spanish because it is very idiosyncratic. Even though it's really close to Thessaloniki, it's very different. So people who were interested in the Monastirli dialect of Judeo-Spanish went into Monastir, and they were all fascinated with songs because there was the idea that songs didn't change so much, and so the words would be like more quote unquote authentic to an earlier otherwise lost dialect of Judeo-Spanish. So 2 people in particular, Max Luria and Cynthia Cruz, both US based. I don't know of any Spaniards, but that is certainly very possible. But I know these 2 U.S. scholars both went to Monastir, and they wrote down a lot of ballads, but they only wrote them down. They didn't indicate anything about their musicality. So Sarah actually on her CD uses one of the texts that Max Luria wrote down and composes new music to it in a historically informed way. That song's called Espinello. So we have the text of a great number of pre-war ballads and things, but we don't have the music for them.
Great. Any other? It can also be comments or questions.
Yeah. I can ask another question while people are thinking of their questions. I also wonder, like, have you come across in your research sort of other analogous situations where memory is really held in this way through music?
Can you elaborate a little bit more? Sorry.
Well, like this seems, I mean, the story is just so fascinating, right? And like it seems like so much of what's held in memory is precisely through music. And I'm just wondering if you'd come across, like you said, when Patricia asked you, you know, how did you come to this? That was such a great answer that like you read this monograph like a novel, you got so interested in this particular community. But I'm just wondering if if you've come across sort of outside of this space, another situation where there's this kind of carrying of memory in music and through musical traditions from a community that was completely destroyed. I mean, I don't know of any others. I'm just wondering if you've come across any.
Certainly. I think in a lot of ways for the like, so my focus is specifically like Mediterranean Sephardic communities, so I don't have like a massively broad geographical frame for this, but I do know that there were very similar phenomenon happening in Thessaloniki, for example. So there was a young woman, Bowina Sarfati, who survived Auschwitz, because all the Thessaloniki Jews were deported to Auschwitz. She survived that deportation, and after the war, then was able to write down both songs she remembered and songs that she composed herself, to sort of memorialize things that people might not think about otherwise, because like we have so many records of these communities, but like so much of the day-to-day part of their lives can be lost when you're just looking at like ledgers and things like that. So I know that's certainly a case in Thessaloniki, but I also don't think it's unique to music as an art. Music is my speciality, but my second love in life, food, is also really important for this. So alongside music, my field informants would so often talk about knowing their community through their foods. So I think food is another way that these memories are passed down.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yeah, that makes complete sense in terms of they're both so embodied in a way, right? It's not about reading or you know, it's about either hearing or tasting, and they're just those senses are so embodied. It's like when you smell a fragrance that brings back a memory in a way that
Yeah,
perhaps reading something might not.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. For sure.
There is a question from Maxine Carr in the chat. What is the population makeup of Monastir today? Have its synagogues been rebuilt?
No Jews have lived in Monastir since 1943. Um, so there was a population of 3,617. Five survived by fighting with the Yugoslavian partisans. So five escaped deportation. They hid the morning of the deportations because they got a tip off. And then they hid for a month, and then later were able to escape into the mountains. But everyone who was deported was immediately killed. But there was no selection process, as there so often is. And those five, they did come back for a month or so because they thought they came back to Monastir for a month or so because they thought their families would come back. But that obviously didn't happen. So all of the Jews in North Macedonia, to my knowledge, live in Skopje, which is the capital of North Macedonia. So there are no Jews in Monastir today. It's a Christian and Muslim community. All the synagogues were ripped down. There are plaques in certain parts of the city saying where they were. And really notably, actually, where their main synagogue was is the Chaim Abernavel Health Center. So Chaim Abernavel was a Jewish doctor who lived in the town, and actually I lied to you. He did survive deportation because they picked him out because he was a doctor, and everyone was like dying of typhus. So he returned not to live. He lived in Skopje, but he gave his blessing sort of for the hospital to be built on the former site of the biggest synagogue of the community. And there's also a bust of one of the partisan women, Estrella Obadiah, who died fighting. So there's the hospital that has like a memorial plaque, and there's the bust of Estrella.
Thank you. There's a comment in the chat. Tara, you can probably, sorry, Tara, you can probably see it too. Noam Vanzana performed Ladino love ballads at the North Carolina Folk Festival last year in Greensboro, and she has also performed with Sarah.
Thank you so much for the recommendation.
Yeah. Well, I think we're coming up. Adam. Adam tells us one text that may be of interest is Augustine Calvet's 1917 De Paris en Monastir, which are travel narratives.
Are
Yeah.
you the one who recalled that, Adam?
I did not. But I know I haven't looked at it in years, but when you're talking about Monastir, I went back through some of my research files and came across that. I know that he speaks about Thessaloniki's Jewish population. I'm not sure if he does the same about Monastir, but of course it wouldn't be surprising.
Yeah, I've looked through his narratives. I don't know French very well. But I know.
It's in Spanish.
Okay, there we
Yeah.
go. Sorry, I just saw Calvet and like my mind went blank. I saw Paris and I was like, oh, French. Yes, I've looked through his narratives. I didn't find anything on first look, but that doesn't mean it's not there.
It's quite possible. I just wanted to
Yeah.
throw it your way.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry, there was a really loud car honk outside of my house. The look was not for Adam.
I didn't hear it. Well, I hope you do something with this, and because it's, you put so much work into it, and it's such an important story, and not one that many of us have heard of, or I'll speak for myself, I certainly hadn't. Brett, yeah, you hadn't either, and yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening, for having me, for great questions. I really appreciate it.
Thanks to everyone who came.